Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. From websites and online stores, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence. Hello friends, I hope that you've been well. In today's video, I am going to be continuing my screenshot redraw series, and today I'm going to be recreating a scene from Sleeping Beauty. If you are not familiar with my channel or this series, I've been doing it on my channel for a while, and basically I take a screenshot from some of my favorite movies, TV shows, sometimes a music video, and I recreate it in my style. And in this kind of series, I like to discuss the process of it, but also what I'm kind of learning and taking from the style or the composition, or basically I'm just using it as a way to study in some way, whether it be composition or background, things like that. And I also like to use this as a mode of podcasting in a way. I like to talk about the media a little bit as well. And I normally don't film my sketching process that often, but I decided to finally do so in today's video since I know a lot of people have an interest in seeing the sketching process. But as you can see, I sketch quite light, and so it's hard to see what's happening. And I like to sketch light because I do a lot of erasing, and I of course don't want to ruin the surface of the paper by pressing too hard with the pencil. But yeah, as some of you probably know, I almost exclusively sketch with a red erasable pencil. I just find that it doesn't smudge nearly as much as a regular graphite pencil does, and I find that the red just blends nicely with the paint or markers or whatever it is that I'm using. But yeah, I had quite a bit of trouble with centering the characters in the page. I kept having to erase them and move them back and forth. And I also had trouble with the proportions of Aurora specifically. Something that I've noticed with Disney characters, especially the female ones, is that their bodies are so petite, and it's just a difficult thing for me to wrap my head around. And of course, I could have changed it to suit my own personal style, but in the case of this particular screenshot, I wanted to keep the style closer to the original because I just find that there's so much to learn from the shape language, especially in Sleeping Beauty. I just find the simplification of all of the shapes and the lines and the way that it's been kind of in a very minimal way just so attractive and interesting to look at. And it's something that I want to incorporate more and more into my own artwork, is simplifying shapes and just having a more just flow to my illustrations. But before we continue, I want to thank today's sponsor, Squarespace. As you probably know by now, Squarespace is a great website building platform that is perfect for a variety of creatives. As someone who creates illustrations as well as YouTube videos, a very useful feature that I recently found out about is that I can attach a link to the corresponding illustration in my gallery, which allows me to feature 2 pieces of content at once. This is especially helpful if anyone is curious about the materials or process. It takes them directly to the video, which is so quick and efficient. So if you are interested in launching your own website, head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/imawonder for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now on to the actual painting portion of this screen cap study. As you can see, I have a very dirty paint palette here, and personally with regular gouache, I like to reactivate the paint from an old palette so that I am using up any of the paint that was left over from a previous session. And you know, I love being able to prevent wasting art supplies as much as possible. Plus, I am a little lazy, so it also justifies me not having to clean my palette all the time. And that is probably my favorite feature of regular gouache over acrylic gouache, is being able to reactivate the gouache over and over and over in the palette. So to start out, I was working on the figures here, and I went with all of the colors that I felt like was already on the palette that could be used within the piece, to just prevent having to mix colors if I didn't need to. And this was a good and bad thing, because it saved me a little bit of time because the color was already there. But then I realized that the colors that were already on the palette weren't quite exactly the colors that I needed in a lot of cases, particularly the skin tones. I had a lot of trouble getting them quite right. And I think the main issue was that I kept forgetting how big of a color shift there is when you have the wet gouache versus the dry gouache, because with acrylic gouache, there isn't nearly as much of a significant shift in the color. And with regular gouache, there is, especially light tones, they dry significantly darker. So the skin tones just were something that I went over and over with. But thankfully, that is the huge benefit of gouache, is that it's an opaque medium. So even though I had to repaint the skin tones several times, there isn't much issue in terms of covering it up. Unfortunately, this one white tube of paint was quite the struggle bus to open, so I ended up actually puncturing a hole in it, which I find a solution for, you'll see in a bit. But yeah, so white is definitely something that got incorporated into a lot of this existing color palette here on the palette, because a lot of the colors I needed to be a little lighter. And as you'll see throughout the process, I just use plain tap water in a little bottle to add the water onto the palette to reactivate the paints and to dilute the paint. I find that, one, it is clean. It'll always be clean water because it's self-contained. And also, I just find I have a lot of control with having a little dropper in terms of adding the water onto the palette. So with the regular gouache here, the thing about it is, yes, you can reactivate it when it's dry, but if it got dried out within this tube, I would have a really hard time accessing it. And so I decided to empty it out as best I could into this little empty container. And that way, even though this container is not perfectly airtight, it is a type of container where I can still easily access and re-wet the paint so that I can still use it. And so that is something that I've actually done before with a different Arteza gouache tube. I don't know what it is. I guess the paint just dries out on the edge underneath the lid and then makes it almost impossible to open again. So that's my little tip if you've had this happen to you. And so now I'm introducing all of the black on the characters. Normally, I don't add black or super dark colors this early on in a painting because I'm often worried about accidentally mixing it with the lighter colors, especially when it comes to a water-activated paint. But I felt like I needed to do it for this because I wanted to get all the flats in for the characters before going into the background for the most part. And then I also wanted to get a better gauge of my values, where I find that adding in your darkest value kind of earlier on, I'm realizing is really helpful in understanding what the rest of the values are going to look like amongst that darkest value, if that makes sense. Because when you add in that black, all of a sudden, all the other tones and colors in the piece look lighter, as opposed to only being against the white of the paper. And so now you can see I am going in with the background here. Again, I'm using a lot of the pre-mixed colors that were already on the palette and just blocking in the kind of large areas of color pretty haphazardly, I suppose. Obviously being careful of the edges of the characters and just trying to get a decent amount of variation in tones, particularly with the foliage. So paying attention to the screenshot where there are some greens that are blue leaning and then some greens that are more yellow leaning. That's something that creates a lot of interest in the piece, is varying the hues. And then I'm also going in with the rough kind of block in of this tree. The interesting thing about this piece is that the tree is actually quite purple, which is not something you would think for a tree trunk. You would usually associate that with brown, but I think the reason why it is purple or very like blue leaning is because they want the tree to recede into the background. And so with the sky and the tree, it is very blue to like fade into the background, and then all of the warm greens is kind of coming forward. And then of course the characters are very warm toned, so they come even closer to the viewer. Which, speaking of the background, something that most of you would be familiar with if you have been following me for a little while is that most of the time with my illustrations, which primarily focus on portraits and people, is that I often render them and do much more shading. But for the sake of this particular screenshot study, I decided that I wanted to, again, like I was saying with the sketching as well, is that I wanted to keep the characters closer or more similar to the original. And so I decided that I would keep them fairly flat, and I didn't do a ton of rendering on them because I wanted to put most of my focus and energy on the background, which is something that I really want to get better at and just become less intimidated by. I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way about backgrounds, especially if you're someone who primarily does characters and portraits. Backgrounds always just feel so daunting and intimidating, and I was a little intimidated going into this screenshot redraw because at first glance the background looks so detailed, which I guess it is, but if you break it down layer by layer or piece by piece, it becomes less intimidating. And also I think that as artists, just with anything that seems out of your comfort zone, the more that you do it, you get more experience and thus you become more comfortable with it. And so that's been kind of a huge part of why I love doing these screenshot studies, is that it allows me to focus on actually just learning and exploring, as opposed to worrying about any creative energy that is normally required for something that's totally original. And so it's good to just have a balance and go back and forth, especially during a time in my artistic journey right now where I feel a little bit stagnant, or I just don't really know exactly what direction I want to take my art. I find that I'm the type of person, and maybe it's my Libra-ness coming through, but I just find that there's so many different avenues in which my art could go, and I'm constantly struggling with exactly where I want to take it. And so just doing these style studies, it really just helps me narrow down what I really like about certain pieces or the process of it, and also what can be introduced and what makes sense to put into my own artwork. And so something that I really love about Sleeping Beauty, which is why I chose it as one of my screenshot studies, is The artwork is just so beautiful. The concept artist that is, I think, was kind of the main person who worked on the look and feel for Sleeping Beauty. I'm going to say their name wrong. I'm going to have it on screen. Ivan Earl sounds correct, I think. But anyway, the concept work that they did, it's so beautiful and it just feels unique to a lot of the Disney, especially those like earlier Disney princess films. It just feels so stylish and really focused on shape. And I think that's something that my work really lacks, is just very intentional shapes. And shape language is something that I had mentioned earlier. And I think that's something I really want to try and push in my work. So he seemed, I think it's a he, this artist seemed like the perfect person to study from. And yeah, Sleeping Beauty is not actually one of my favorite Disney films overall. If you were to ask me what my favorite Disney film is, it would probably be either Mulan or Hercules, which, by the way, Mulan is a screenshot redraw video that I've already done if you're interested in seeing that and you haven't seen it yet. But in terms of just style and look, I knew I wanted to do Sleeping Beauty regardless of the fact that I don't consider it to be my favorite Disney film. I think probably the reason why it's not my favorite Disney film is while visually it looks so beautiful and just really appeals to me visually, I find that the story and the movie overall kind of quiet and slow, which kind of adds to, I think, the overall look and feel. Like it just has this sort of slow, meandering, slightly eerie, quiet vibe to it. So the style, I think, does suit the tone of the movie. But I remembered as a kid, I found it incredibly boring. Like it's just not very exciting to a child. And even as an adult, I just find, it just doesn't engage me in the same way as the like 90s Disney films do in terms of the music and the characters and things like that. So, I mean, a lot of that has to do, I think, with just the original Sleeping Beauty story, is the fact that she is asleep for most of it. But yeah, I love the look of this film. The character design as well. I really, really like the way that Aurora's hair is stylized, just those like big swooping waves and little curl. And I also really love her cottagecore outfit. I think that it's so timeless and is something that I could definitely see people wearing now on just a fairly normal basis. Here we get to a really satisfying part of the process where I finally start doing the kind of top layers of the foliage, which I had so much fun with. And I think that this is definitely a process and look that I'm going to take into future illustrations. Just having that kind of dark base and then going on top with different hues of green on top, it just creates such an interesting, visually enriching look to it. It's got so much depth, and when it's finished, it just looks so intimidating, but in reality, it's actually quite simple in execution and honestly very therapeutic. Something that I'm definitely realizing is that for backgrounds, I find that anything organic is much more approachable, because even if maybe it's not super accurate, it reads fine because it's an organic thing, as opposed to man-made things like buildings or cars or things like that. I find that is much more difficult to execute because there's just more room for error and requires just so much more energy to try and get right. So yeah, anyway, I'm really, really digging how the background came out, and I also really, really enjoyed the process of painting it as well. That's something that I really need to pay attention to as well. I think moving forward is not only am I paying attention to how I want my artwork to look like, but I'm also wanting to focus on enjoying the process as well. Because at the end of the day, art should be an enjoyable process. So if I find something excruciating to do, then what's the point, right? So you got to pay attention to the process, but also the result. Which, speaking of, on the topic of having fun with the process of making art, when I was working on painting this piece, for the most part, I was listening to music, but then for the kind of bulk, I did actually put on a movie. I talked about this in a previous YouTube video where I discussed how to combat art block when you're feeling unmotivated. And one of the things I touched on is to put on a piece of media that you are really familiar with / really enjoy. That way your brain is still being engaged in some way and being entertained while you're working on your art. And so I put on The Iron Giant, which is an animated film that is so good and so underrated. And I love that movie. And it was so nice to watch it again, even though I didn't really watch a ton of it because I was working on this, but to hear it, obviously. And I'm kind of debating on maybe wondering if I want to do that for a screenshot redraw. Stylistically, it's very different, I think, from anything that's related to my work, but it's just a film that I love so much, so it might be a fun excuse to just talk about it. But yeah, maybe in the next one, maybe I should do something that's not an animated film. Maybe I should go back to something that's live action just to switch it up. As I'm saying this, I realize I definitely should have just put on Sleeping Beauty when working on this. It would have felt the most appropriate. But I do feel like I was saying earlier, that what my favorite part about Sleeping Beauty is the visual. And so maybe that's why I didn't think initially to choose that film to put on while I was working on this, because I wouldn't actually be watching the visuals that much. So now that I've been discussing this movie, I do want to watch it really, really soon. And you know what? Maybe I will enjoy it more than I am leading on, because it's been quite a while since I've actually seen it. And I think that now that I'm older, maybe the kind of slower, quiet vibe of the film might suit me better than when I was much younger when I had last seen it. And now that I'm thinking about the film more, I am remembering or recalling that there is some humorous moments in it, like with the fairy godmothers when they keep roasting each other about, the cake or making the dress, and, the switching it back from blue and pink, which I will say, I think I actually did prefer the blue for Aurora. I just think that blonde hair and baby blue is such a nice combination, but I guess Disney probably stick to pink for Aurora because in the kind of scope of the Disney princesses lineup, Cinderella is a blonde princess with a baby blue dress, so it makes sense that they would want to make that distinction between the two. But like I was mentioning earlier, her cottagecore outfit is definitely my favorite, which is why I chose this screenshot, because that's what she's wearing. It feels very on trend, the cottagecore and the corset vibe. It's so beautiful. I love it. Even the headband. But yeah, another thing that I think I'm discounting with Sleeping Beauty is Maleficent is incredible. I think that movies are really elevated when the villain is appealing, and Maleficent is definitely a really, really cool villain. And I do love the whole sequence of her turning into a dragon, and that whole fight is very, very cool. And the green flames, the colors are just so amazing. Okay, I'm like, as I'm talking, I'm convincing myself to watch this movie very, very soon, and I will probably love it more than I am letting on in this video. Which, speaking of Maleficent, I did find that the live action Maleficent films to be fairly enjoyable. I think that Angelina Jolie was a perfect Maleficent, and I just loved the character design of her. Those like pointy cheekbones was incredible. And I think that part of why I probably liked that iteration more than a lot of these other Disney quote unquote live action remakes is that it wasn't exactly a remake, it was more of a retelling. So it was like essentially a new story because they were creating a backstory for Maleficent, which we had never seen before. And I think that's a more interesting take as opposed to these other ones like Lion King or Aladdin, where it's too similar. So to me, I just feel like, what's the point in rehashing essentially the same story over again? And I'm obviously very biased because I'm just such a lover of 2D animation as well. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. I feel like I've probably discussed my distaste for the live action remakes extensively before, but I will say, yeah, the Maleficent ones I did find much more enjoyable. But again, I think that's because it felt like a totally new story, essentially. But yeah, we are winding down. We're getting to the kind of tail end of this process video. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for watching my videos and for supporting me and my channel this year. This will probably be my last video of 2022. I can't believe the year is pretty much over. It really flew by. And I know that I definitely sounded pretty hard on myself in the past couple of videos, and I just wanted to now channel that energy into motivation and fuel for new and better art and content going into 2023. I don't think I'm going to set any hard or fast resolutions for myself because I find resolutions can be a little bit disheartening if you don't meet them. So I think it might be best for me to just kind of go into the new year with just a refreshed attitude and just excitement for whatever it is that I decide to do and pursue. So anyways, thank you so much for all of your support this year. I really appreciate it. And I hope that you all have a safe and happy holiday and New Year's. And I will catch you next year. Bye.